Hey, welcome Rich Birch to the Social Media Church Podcast. We're going to have a conversation with a church leader about social media. Rich Birch is the Director of Operations at Liquid Church in New Jersey. It is multi-site, and I think they just added another location. Rich, thank you for joining me.
Hey, DJ, thanks so much for having me on your show. I'm super excited to talk with you today.
Yeah, so what's happening at Liquid Church now? How many locations, and what is your role there?
Yeah, good question. So Liquid Church is a four-campus multi-site church. We serve the Manhattan-facing suburbs of New Jersey, so kind of the north end of New Jersey. You know, there really is like two states. North and South Jersey are two totally different places, and so we serve the north end. You know, we're always looking for new locations. We haven't announced any, or it's a part of my job is trying to bake new locations, and they're always at some part of the process. But yeah, that gives you a sense of who we are. We're not that old of a church. We've been around 7 years. Just celebrated our 7th anniversary at Easter this year.
7 years. I mean, you've made a big footprint in 7 years, certainly on social media as well as traditional media, because you've got a pretty sharp guy there, Kenny Jang, who
Kenny's a great guy.
The first guest on our Social Media Church podcast. So he
had
a big role in kicking us off, and now we are on past episode number 85, and
crazy.
Since that time, you've started podcasting too. So we're going to talk a bit about Christian and church leadership podcasting. But before we do that, describe how you use social media personally, and then how your church uses social media, as much as you know, because you're not the social media director, but you are director of operations.
Yeah, nice. No, that's great. Kenny's a great guy on our team. We're super happy to have him, and he does a fantastic job. So yeah, like me personally, it's funny. I still remember the first time I heard about Facebook. So I was the guy. I lived in Canada at the time, and our lead pastor was on MySpace, and it was interesting because he's one of those guys. He's actually an introvert, which is funny to think because he's a teaching pastor at a church of, they're probably 6,000, 7,000 people, and so he's on stage all the time. And he had this great paradigm of, like, he'd say, listen, I don't know, the way God's wired me, I'd rather either be sitting way in the back row, not talking to anyone, or be on the stage. And I remember he got involved in this thing called MySpace, and I remember thinking, man, this is a waste of time. Why are you doing this? And he and I were out on a speaking tour, and we were at this one university, this college, and I remember these students saying, have you been on the Facebook? To each other, and this was when it was in limited release. It was just in colleges at that point, and I remember the thing that turned me, that I can still remember that conversation. It turned me to think, oh, there's something different there. This one guy said to this other guy, he's like, yeah, I was able to pull together a flag football game in like half an hour. I just posted on there like, hey, we're all going to be at whatever commons playing, looking for some players for flag football, and all these guys showed up. And I remember sitting forward thinking, oh, there's something there. A piece of technology that can move people socially and can connect with people socially. And so shortly after, it ended up opening up. And so personally, I use it, obviously in my personal life to connect with friends and family. It's a great way to stay up. I'm married with 2 kids, and so it's a great way to stay connected with my mom, so I don't have to call her all the time. But it's also, a great way as a church, obviously, to connect to, to people as well. I would say in my personal life, I use Facebook, and then really with church stuff, we use Facebook a lot at church too, but then, with other church leaders, I use Twitter more, with other church leaders.
Director of operations, do you oversee the staff, or are you more of the process guy? What part of the church operations do you manage?
Yeah, it's a great title. It basically means all the stuff that other people don't want to do. So I'm a part of the 4-part leadership team at Liquid. So there's 4 of us: myself, Tim Lucas, our lead guy, Dave Brooks, and Mike Leahy. So I'm one of those people. It's funny, when I interact with a lot of people who do operations out of their churches, they're like, oh, I don't do anything that you do. The title, I think, is somewhat misplaced. So I oversee all our service programming, all our communications, campus expansion, and those are really kind of my day jobs, and then have taken on a bit of the just special projects stuff. So whenever whenever there's something happening that we don't really have anybody to look after, I try to help with that stuff too.
What you're doing there at Liquid Church, because you are doing some things considerably differently than the traditional church, and you need to name those things differently. So
Right.
I can see how it plays out. I mean,
Yeah.
Kenny Jang has the title of Director of Innovation. You mentioned special projects, and so you're definitely thinking on the edge. What was the special thing you did over Easter? I noticed something about CSI.
Yeah, we did. So, obviously Easter is a significant time of year to be inviting new people. Easter is an interesting, and your guests know this, but it really is probably even more so than Christmas. It's one of those times when two magical things happen. One, people who don't attend church on a regular basis are still more culturally willing to come to church, and our people are more likely to invite their friends to church that time of year than any other time of year. And so we want to really take advantage of that and really try to motivate our people as much as possible to invite their friends to come, because not only are they more likely to do it, but their friends are more likely to say yes at Easter. So we've really tried this year to build, every year you only get a chance to get that window really only opens up once a year. At least for us, it opens up once a year. Christmas is a big time of year for us as well, but it's unique at Easter, particularly obviously because it has to do with the resurrection, right? It's the time where we get to proclaim the message, the gospel. But so this year we've done it a little bit differently in that we're trying to extend the Easter season over a couple months. And so leading up to Easter, before a month out from Easter, we hosted a special guest in a guy by the name of J. Warner Wallace, who is he used to be an LA, or actually still is, an LA crime detective, cold case guy. And he really had this question early on in his faith. He said, what if he applied the same skills that he uses in his day job to the teaching of Jesus and to Jesus' life? And so we kind of built this series leading up to Easter as a high attractional. We've had some success in the past with people inviting to when it's a special guest. And so a month out, we had this whole series running, and then obviously Easter is a big day, and so we were able to kind of have a double whammy there of kind of a bunch of new people coming out a month before Easter. We know they're not going to come back because people don't, if they just started coming, they typically won't come the next week. But then we were able to invite them for Easter, which was our largest Easter ever in the history of our church, which was great. And then we're continuing that with post-Easter programming this year to try to keep them coming back, which has so far seems to be working.
How important is the role of communication in doing that? You mentioned that you oversee a bit of the communication, and communication in the 21st century here in 2014 definitely involves social media, as well as online communication, of which you have an online campus. And then I believe you're pretty strategic on your traditional print-based and perhaps other media types of communication. How do you coordinate all of those things?
Yeah, so that role does fall to me. So that is a part of what I spend my days thinking about, and I think it's super important. We use a lot of social media. We do spend a lot of time thinking about how we leverage Facebook and trying to create content for Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. It's a part of our workflow as an organization. So when we lead into a series, we're thinking about, okay, what do we need to do before the series on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, particularly, to kind of excite people, and then is there any content that we can use kind of as the series is going on to keep people interested and engaged. But for whenever we push up to these big days, 3 or 4 times a year, we really do try to pull out the stops and use basically anything possible to communicate with our folks. And so, we'll do obviously all the stuff I just listed, but we'll do direct mailing, we'll do PR stuff. This year we actually experimented. We phoned 2,000 households the week before Easter in an old school, open the phone up and call them. and my thinking on that, or our thinking on that, is really we want to surround our people with messaging. And so some people prefer getting stuff through Facebook, but we know that a lot of people don't, even though we're obviously, I know this is a social media church podcast, but there's a large percentage of our people, even though we're targeting that kind of 30-something person, there's a lot of those people that they don't track with us, or they're not as in on the social media stuff. And so we need to make sure we don't just use that channel, particularly for those big days.
Oh, that's really interesting. So not only are you trying to target 30-something, and not all of them respond to social media, so that's a big learning, because they're stereotyped as
Yes,
saturated,
right,
and your experience is saying maybe 2/3 are, and 1/3 aren't.
I'll give you an example of that. Our lead pastor, Tim Lucas, obviously beloved. People love him, and over 14 years ago, his dad was diagnosed with cancer, and it's been kind of Tim doesn't talk about it all the time, but every couple months, it obviously just works its way into his messages, and so in some ways the church has been journeying with him through that process. Well, about a month ago, or I guess probably 6 weeks ago now, his dad passed away, and that's obviously an important in his family, a big day, obviously, and was had incredible impact. And the way that communication rolled out is he talked about it on Facebook first before we ended up into the weekend, and I'd have to go back and look at the post, but it literally was hundreds of comments, tons of response online, and then we went into that weekend. I just happened to be doing announcements at our largest campus that weekend, and so we were talking about it. We were kind of letting people know, and at every service there were audible gasps. There was like, "Oh wow," which it tweaked in my head. Because if you would have asked me before that, I'm like, no, everybody's heard about it. It's something all over Facebook this week. But in our audience, there definitely was a significant segment that it was the first time they had heard about it was in our weekend services, which was a good reminder for me that although social media is super important, these other forms of communication are critical if we really want to get the message out.
And so, as social media becomes more mainstream and matures, what I'm sensing or feeling is that communication now is so fragmented,
right,
that some people only hear things through Facebook, some people only hear things through newspaper or television or Netflix or Twitter or whatever channel they are most comfortable with or what they swim in. Mm-hmm. And then there's a small emerging tribe that's just wanting to react and say they just want to stay offline. So there's this circle kind of dynamic too. So
true.
It's definitely very, very interesting times how communication is managed within the flow of the church. Couple questions related to that, and then I want to talk specifically about your Unseminary podcast.
Sure.
How many people, staff and volunteer, do you coordinate to execute on your social media strategy, and then do you have some policies or guidelines that you use to guide the messaging?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's a couple different ways we could answer it. So Kenny works part-time for us, and then he has a part-time kind of web social media person that works with him. So probably together, that's probably a 3/4 time, when they say where they actually spend their time, maybe somewhere between a half and 3/4 time, because she also does web stuff for us as well. And then outside of that, we have a full-time virtual assistant in the Philippines. We can talk more about that if you're interested in that, who helps us just purely with social media. And then really, increasingly we're trying to see all our staff as so we're 40 some odd people, really, as all of them are really pieces of the social media landscape. When they talk about us online, or so we're consistently, particularly leading up to those big days, we're asking them like, hey, here's stuff to post online. Here, please do this, please do that. Here's a video to interact with. Please like, share, comment this. That sort of thing. There are some volunteers, but there's not a lot. It's a fairly centralized staff team environment on the communications side. Partly because, like you've said, on the control, even just with the people we've talked about there, controlling messaging is difficult, and so I'm a bit of a control freak, and so we've kept it into a smaller, tighter circle. And the reality is, you can go a long way and make a lot of difference with a small group of people who are pointing in the right direction.
In your podcast, you just had a recent episode talking about control versus growth.
Yeah, exactly.
And what social media opens up is, well, you can't control it, but you can
Yes.
also let it go and have the potential go viral in all kinds of different directions as well.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
let's use that as a segue to talk about podcasting.
Hmm.
And tell us what prompted you to launch the Unseminary podcast. I know you've been blogging about Unseminary, and then however many months back you launched this Unseminary podcast.
Yeah, so Unseminary, I started blogging in 2009, and then I rebranded, I think, in 2011 to Unseminary. And the idea with Unseminary is that I want to create a website where really church leaders can learn the stuff they don't teach in seminary. There's the sad truth is that so many churches bog down in really practical stuff around communications, around how they lead, around and a lot of times it's tactical, tips and tricks that churches can, if they just knew, they could be more effective. They could go further, faster. And so that's really what Unseminary is all about. We're 300 and plus posts, 300 and some odd posts on all different kinds of stuff. It really does skew a lot. There's a lot of communication stuff on there. Partly because just I'm interested in that. So then last September, so we're 30 some odd episodes in, I launched a podcast, and the thinking on why I wanted to do a podcast is a couple things. One, I realized that in my writing, my personality doesn't come through because I'm trying to create very compressed, like almost like you could print it off, and if you just follow these 6 steps, you can do it kind of writing. And that's on purpose because I know church leaders don't have a lot of time. And so I want to make stuff. So it's always like 6 tips to do this, or 7 things to think when you do that, or 12 things when you blah, blah, blah. And that just doesn't really lend to my personality. And so it's a bit of a faceless organization behind that. And so I wanted my own personality to come through. And then I also wanted to bring in other voices, partly because you're just always hearing from yourself. It's really not that interesting. And so it's been great. I've loved it. In some ways, it's 2 totally different audiences. I've been doing some polling with my audience, and there's the people who read the blog, and then there's the people who listen to the podcast. And although there's an overlap, it's more of a Venn diagram. It's not. It's really created 2 different audiences, which has been fun.
And so, as your personality has come through on podcasting, you actually record both a video and an audio version. What is the thinking behind that?
Yeah, so there's a part of this just influenced by some online, thinkers who, you want to create content. What's that?
Influencers.
Yeah, you were paused out there, clipped out. Sorry.
Oh, who are your influencers?
Oh, there's a lot. There's this guy out there who's not a Christian leader at all. His name's James Schramko. He's a kind of marketing business, make money online guy, which is not really my goal. But the interesting thing, his podcast, the thing I find interesting, part of what he talks about is you got to make content in a format that your people want, and instead of really forcing everyone into one thing or another, you can create content that can replicate in a bunch of different ways. And so I've tried to do that with the podcast. So we record them in video. People can watch them in video. There's obviously the audio version as well. Also provide extensive show notes where they either have just kind of the highlights. You can actually get a pretty good sense when you read the kind of highlights of where the episode goes with markers. If you want to jump ahead just to that part, you could do that, or then full transcripts. And it's been interesting because that was a theory. Like, I don't know if but I know there's people, because I've heard multiple people say, I don't listen to your podcast, but I do read the transcript because I can crank through it really quickly. They're a speed reader or whatever, and they're thankful for that. And so it's been fun to see that. And ultimately what I'm trying to do is profile other leaders. And so every week I interview a different leader, and it's all based around the same idea. What's kind of a problem you faced or that other churches might face, and how did you overcome it? And so we interview, talk that through, and then I try to create something that then can be replicated in a bunch of different ways.
So 30-some episodes into recording and posting.
Mm-hmm.
I'll rewind that. So you're 30-plus episodes into the Unseminary podcast. What have you learned along the way?
Yeah, I've learned a lot. I think early on, I saw a lot of podcasts, would get to the infamous, episode 7. It seems like for whatever reason, a lot of podcasts die at 5, 6, 7. They just can never get beyond that. And so when I started, I said, you know, I don't want to start a podcast. I want to start a system for producing podcasts. That's a whole other conversation around how I interact with, you know, guests and all that. But so I wanted to, because I realized that the value for listeners is built over the long haul. It's not built in any individual episode. It's, you know, the fact that they can depend that weekly there's going to be, every Thursday morning I'm going to give them something to think about. Here's a 20-minute conversation with some church leader, and they may only get one nugget out of that, but that's okay, because next week there'll be something else. And that's general. That's true about my blog content too. I'm never really trying to write some like viral hit that I think, oh my goodness, this is going to get like stumbled upon, or, you know, that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to create tons of content that kind of have walk-away value on each of them. So I think that's been important. The system side of it's been important. You know, I think I'm always amazed. I always think like, I don't know, like, how many more people can I talk to about multi-site? And I'm blown away that, yeah, you know, you talk to a church leader about what they're learning, and you can always pull out or learn something that, like, that's a very unique concept. I need to pull that out of somebody and learn a bit more for people that are listening.
Yeah, what's interesting, as many multi-sites as we've seen emerge over the past decade or so, over 8,000 according to the latest research from Leadership Network, there's only a few resources that are available, 3 books that are published, and then a smattering of websites and a well-known consultant in Arizona. You know, there's not conferences for it, and so as more people want to learn, it's like, well, where do they go? And so I'm so glad that you're sharing some of those insights as things develop, because I think in the 21st century, things are constantly developing. You can't just publish a book and expect it to be valuable for 5 or 10 years, although there's some things that are transcendent, but there's a lot more and a lot more that's constantly developing and flowing.
Yeah, I was just talking to a church leader this week from a 60-plus-year-old church that's now launched 3 campuses. They've planted a bunch of churches over the years, and they decided to shift their strategy and are planting campuses or launching campuses. And, you know, it's a fascinating conversation, because I said to the leader, I'm like, I don't think I've talked to a lot of churches your age that are doing multi-site. You know, it's a lot of times it's that, like, they're boomer churches. They've been around 20 years, or they've been around 10 years, and they're launching. And the dynamics are different there. You know, that has a different feel when it's a heritage church. It's been around for a long time. It has a very rich history. And then when they try to export, and I'm like, that's a fascinating conversation, particularly for someone like me who's working in a church that's only been around 7 years. You know, that's an interesting, you know, dialogue.
Yeah, and I'm kind of chuckling to myself as you described how you wanted to develop the system as you launched the podcast.
Right.
Spoken so well like a director of operations.
Yeah.
Now, as a director of operations, you're probably into numbers as well. What do you look at in your metrics to know that you're accomplishing the goal that you set out to do with your podcast?
Yeah, no, I think the big one is downloads. You know, are people downloading it currently? You know, we're hovering every episode. You know, I'm hovering somewhere between 750 and 1,000 downloads, which for me is fantastic. You know, it's always humbling. You know, I'm like, gosh, so you're telling me that there's, you know, even if you half those numbers because people are double downloading them or something like that, you know, that's hundreds of church leaders that are out there listening in and giving me 20 minutes of their time, 25 minutes of their time every week. And so I want to be a good steward of that. I think that's a big one. You know, sharing is it's always intriguing to me. I haven't been able to predict, but in blog posts or in podcast episodes, which ones are going to take. It happens all the time where I'm like, oh, I think this one will be big, and then it doesn't, or vice versa. It's just for whatever reason, people take it and run with it. I try not to chase those numbers too much because I think the value is built over the long haul. But obviously, I pay attention to that stuff, look at it.
Good counsel. And one of the things that I've noticed as I've started into podcasting, probably a year before you started, and I'm definitely more for the long haul and planting seeds over time, the thing I notice is 99% of Christian podcasts are just syndications of sermons.
Right.
And so there's only a couple dozen of us that are actually creating podcast content uniquely for a podcast audience that's not syndication from another channel.
Right.
Why do you think that is, that there's so few?
Yeah, you know, I think it's probably a part of a broader, I think it's a good question. I think it's probably even part of a broader conversation, which is I don't know that the church in general is great at leveraging the content that we have. The reality of it is most like churches are content engines. They crank out content all the time. And so, and we don't really leverage it. We just create it and set it on a shelf somewhere. And in a lot of ways, podcasts or church podcasts are just that. They've created this and it's just sitting there. And so I think the reality of it is a lot of church leaders they're just worn out from creating content in other environments, whether it's for Sunday morning or for, the upcoming leaders meeting. And so the thought of like, okay, I'm going to turn around and now make some other piece of content, I just think isn't, it's just unpractical. Which is okay by me. I think it is. That's obviously a part of the reason why I started it was because there seems to be an opportunity there. There seems to be a niche for creating leadership content on a regular basis. I think the other thing too is in my world, I like to interact with church leaders that aren't just in those name brand churches that are like in the 6 churches that seem to get all the press in the country. Because the reality of it is, I run into church leaders all the time who are doing incredible things that I think could have huge impact if they were applied broadly in the body of Christ, in the same way that those 6 churches are doing incredible things that could be, widely applied in a lot of churches. And so it's fun to hear and talk to those churches and get a sense of what's happening, in their world.
Sorry.
That's fine.
Had a brain pause.
Totally fine.
We'll clean it up in post. So, as you continue podcasting, what topic do you think needs to be addressed in the church world that's not being addressed that a new podcast could really hit a blue ocean?
I think this is way outside of my bailiwick. I try to do really practical, like take this stuff and run with it. I think the conversation around, so this, I can't imagine my podcast handling this, but I think a conversation around, the whole sexuality question that's up on our doors. Anybody that's in ministry today, they know that they're dealing with folks in their church that are, same-sex attracted, are somewhere on a very long sexual spectrum, and I think in general, it's probably that conversation this format could be really helpful for that. How are different churches wrestling with that? How are you, what are you doing when Brenda and Kate show up with their kids at check-in? What does that look like? How do you prepare your now that's me going back to practical stuff, but those kinds of issues I think are important, and I think there could be, it could be one of those podcasts that I think could generate a lot of conversation and interest. So that would be one that just jumps to mind, partly because I think it needs more conversation, and I think it's a practical issue that a lot of church leaders are wrestling with today. They're trying to figure out, how do I get handles on this? Because I think that will be a defining issue. How churches respond to the gay community in the next 10 years will be a defining issue for churches.
And indeed, it is a defining issue. Thank you for addressing one of the elephants in the room as we look at the church in the 21st century and where we're at. It's not going to go away.
No.
And it's not something that we can just write a blog post or write a white paper or deliver a series of sermons and here is the answer.
Right.
And I think you're right that the podcast format allows the elasticity to build understanding and see it develop and mature over time rather than just delivering a answer in black and white. So great thought. Any closing thought as we wrap this up?
Oh, I think social media has an incredible impact on the local church. I think it obviously your audience is all going to be people who are convinced of that, so it's not like, oh gosh, I'm surprised.
Actually, it's half and half.
Really? You got haters out there?
Trying to persuade and also advance the conversation.
Yeah,
so treadmill.
I was talking to a church leader this week who, when I asked them, and I think this will be the case going forward, we were talking about kind of how they see their ministry model, and the person said, there's 4 things that they see in their platform, really 4 tools in their tool belt for reaching out to the community around them, and they listed weekend services, they listed what they do in kind of missional community, so small groups. They listed what they call start and stop events, so like conferences, that sort of thing. And in there, they didn't list it in this order. They actually put it second. They listed social media. And I was like, really? Tell me about that. I said, that's the first time I've heard of a church leader list social media as in the same circle as like small groups and weekend services. And I think that's really the case going forward. I think people are rewiring their lives around this technology, and it's not in some ways it really is. It is the internet. It's the foregone conclusion of the internet. The internet is a way for people to connect with other people. It's not technology. I think we have to get it out of the nerd space and realize what it is. It's a way for people all over the world to interact with each other. There's people on the ends of all those connections. And so as church leaders, I think we want to be engaged there. We want to understand that. And it's a great way to get messages out and blah, 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 all that. But a deeper issue is it really is a tool, I think, for us to figure out how do we disciple people, how do we help people take steps in their relationships with Jesus, there. And I think we have a long ways to go and to learn. I feel like, I know from our church point of view, I feel like we're asking the right questions, but we haven't found the answers yet. We're pushing in the right direction, but we're not there yet. And so I encourage people that are in that conversation that are trying to figure that out. Because I think you're a part of the leading edge, trying to lead into the future.
Well, thank you. I couldn't have said it better myself. So thank you so much for really raising our collective awareness for the tremendous opportunity that we do have through technology to do ministry, and it is more about people and not the technology. Technology is opening the door and the opportunity and the platform and the tools to really further the gospel and deepen the gospel for us in our community and around the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much. Rich Birch from the Unseminary blog and podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, man.
All right.